They say grief is a heavy cloak, but for me, it felt more like a suffocating shroud. My husband, Keith, had been buried for exactly 12 days when I finally summoned the strength to open his mahogany wardrobe. We had spent 48 years together in this drafty, 3-story house in the heart of Richmond, Virginia. I thought I knew every crease in his Sunday suits and every secret in his heart. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. As a 72-year-old widow, you expect to find old receipts, maybe a stray cufflink or a forgotten photograph. You don't expect to find a reason to hate a dead man. I was reaching for his heavy wool overcoat, the one he wore every winter when we walked through Monument Avenue, when I felt a strange stiffness in the silk lining. My fingers brushed against something crisp. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt far too young for my tired chest. I grabbed a pair of sewing shears and slit the fabric. Out fell a thick, creamy envelope sealed with red wax. There was no name on the front, no return address, just a date from 3 years ago. When I broke the seal and pulled out the contents, the air left my lungs. It wasn't a love letter. It was a deed to a property I didn't own, a bank statement with a balance that made my head spin, and a handwritten note that turned my blood to ice. Keith, the note began in a feminine, loathsome script. The girl is asking about her father again. The monthly hush payment isn't enough anymore. She wants to meet you. If you don't come to Charlotte by the 15th, I'm coming to Richmond. Don't think your precious wife's reputation will survive this. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the paper trembling in my hand. Charlotte? A girl? A daughter? While I was at home, penny pinching and stretching our retirement funds to keep this house maintained, Keith was funding a second life 2 states away. He had watched me worry about the rising property taxes while he sat on a secret fortune. The betrayal wasn't just the infidelity. It was the calculated, decades-long deception. He had played the role of the devoted, simple husband while harboring a nest of vipers behind his teeth. I looked at the bank statement again. $200,000. That was supposed to be our security. That was supposed to be my peace of mind. Instead, it was blood money used to keep a mistress and a secret child silent. The woman's name was signed at the bottom, Yolanda Vandross. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. Keith was gone, tucked away in a cemetery where I couldn't scream at him, but Yolanda was very much alive. She had spent years eating off my table, metaphorically speaking. She had thrived on the sacrifices I made. She thought the ATM had shut down because Keith's heart stopped. She had no idea that the account holder had changed, and the new manager was not in a giving mood. I walked over to the vanity mirror and looked at myself. I didn't see a grieving widow. I saw a woman who had been robbed of 48 years of honesty. Keith might have escaped justice by dying, but Yolanda and her daughter were about to learn that a woman scorched by lies becomes a wildfire. I wasn't going to cry. I was going to dismantle everything they thought they were entitled to. You should have stayed in the dark, Yolanda, I whispered to the empty room. Because now that I've found you, I'm going to make sure you wish you never knew my husband's name. The plan started forming instantly. It wasn't going to be quick, and it certainly wasn't going to be kind. I was going to reclaim every cent, every ounce of dignity, and I was going to do it with a smile that would terrify the devil himself. I reached for the phone to call the bank, but then I stopped. A simple phone call was too easy. If I wanted true justice, I had to go to Charlotte. I had to see the face of the woman who helped my husband betray me. But what I found when I looked up Yolanda Vandross's social media made my jaw drop. She wasn't just a mistress. She was someone I already knew. The drive from Richmond to Charlotte took just over 3 hours, but it felt like a lifetime of replaying every anniversary, every I love you, and every late night Keith claimed he was working at the firm. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned a ghostly white. I wasn't just driving toward a city. I was driving toward the wreckage of my life. I had spent the previous night scouring the internet. The name Yolanda Vandross had felt familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. When I finally found her profile, I didn't just find a mistress. I found a betrayal that went deeper than I ever imagined. Yolanda wasn't a stranger. She was the daughter of my former best friend, a woman I had helped raise, a girl I had given graduation gifts to, and the very person who had sat in my kitchen drinking tea while I mourned my friend's passing 10 years ago. The audacity of it made me want to scream until my lungs gave out. This girl, this woman now 35 years old, had been sleeping with my husband while calling me auntie. She had used the connection I fostered to worm her way into his pockets and his bed. I pulled my sedan into the driveway of a pristine two-story brick house in a quiet Charlotte suburb. It was far nicer than the one I lived in. My husband had bought her a sanctuary with my retirement. I sat there for a moment, smoothing down my navy blue skirt and adjusting my pearls. I didn't want to look like a victim. I wanted to look like an executioner. I walked up to the front door and rang the bell. I didn't have to wait long. The door swung open, and there she was. Yolanda looked exactly the same. High cheekbones, smooth skin, and that deceptive, wide-eyed look of innocence. When she saw me, her face didn't just drop. It drained of all color. "Mrs. Sterling," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Auntie, what are you doing here?" "The Annie act is over. Yolanda," I said, my voice as sharp as a razor. "And Mrs. Sterling is the woman who owns the deed to this house you're standing in." Or did Keith forget to mention that the gift was purchased with marital assets he had no right to touch? I didn't wait for an invitation. I stepped past her, my heels clicking loudly on the polished hardwood floors. The house smelled like expensive candles and betrayal. In the living room, a young girl, maybe 7 years old, sat on the sofa playing with a tablet. She looked up, and my heart stopped. She had Keith's eyes, those deep, hooded eyes that I had looked into for nearly half a century. Is this the reason Keith was late for dinner every third Thursday of the month? I asked, gesturing toward the child. Yolanda closed the door slowly, her hands shaking. "Listen, it wasn't supposed to happen like this. Keith loved us. He took care of us because he wanted to. You were always so busy with your charities and your house. He was lonely." I turned on her so fast she flinched. "Lonely? I was his wife. I was the woman who stayed by him when he had nothing. You are a thief. You stole time, you stole money, and you stole the memory of a man I thought was honorable. But here's the thing, Yolanda, death has a funny way of settling debts." "What do you want?" she whispered, clutching the collar of her silk robe. "I want everything," I replied. "I've already spoken to my lawyer in Richmond. Since Keith used our joint savings and hidden accounts to purchase this property without my consent, I am filing for a constructive trust. This house is mine. That car in the driveway, mine. The hush money he's been sending, that's over. I've frozen the accounts." Yolanda's eyes filled with tears, the kind of manipulative tears I had seen her use since she was a toddler. "You can't do that. Where are we supposed to go? This is his daughter. You're a Christian woman. You can't just throw a child onto the street." "Don't you dare bring my faith into your filth," I hissed. "You had 10 years to think about this child's future. You chose to build it on a foundation of lies and another woman's misery. As for where you'll go, that's not my concern. But you have 48 hours to pack your bags. After that, I'm changing the locks and selling this place to the highest bidder." "You're a monster," she sobbed. "No," I said, leaning in close so she could smell the peppermint on my breath and the steel in my soul. "I'm a widow who just found out she's been paying for her own husband's mistress for a decade. A monster would have burned this house down with you in it. I'm just a businesswoman conducting a foreclosure. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I saw a framed photo on the hallway table. It was Keith, smiling, holding this woman and the child at a beach I didn't recognize. I picked it up and smashed it against the doorframe. The glass shattered, echoing through the house like a gunshot. 48 hours, Yolanda, or the police will be the ones explaining to your neighbors why you're being evicted. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. It read, "You think the house is the only thing he hid? Check the safety deposit box in the bank on Trade Street. Keith wasn't just a cheater, he was a criminal, and you're the one holding the bag." The text message glowed on my phone screen like a digital curse. My hands, which had been steady while I stared down Yolanda, began to tremble. I sat in my car, the humid Charlotte air thick around me, staring at the brick sanctuary I was about to dismantle. Keith wasn't just a cheater. He was a criminal. The man I had shared a bed with for nearly 50 years, the man who said grace over every Sunday roast, had a life that required a safety deposit box I knew nothing about. I didn't go back to Richmond. I drove straight to Trade Street. The bank was a towering structure of glass and steel, a monument to the kind of secrets people pay to keep buried. As I walked into the lobby, I felt like an interloper. I was the grieving widow, the woman in the navy skirt, the auntie who had been played for a fool. But inside, a cold, hard diamond of fury was stabilizing my spine. "I'm Mrs. Keith Sterling," I told the clerk, my voice steady and regal. I produced the death certificate and the power of attorney documents I'd kept in my purse since the funeral. "My husband kept a box here. I need access immediately." The clerk, a young man with a thin mustache and a nervous disposition, checked his computer. His eyebrows shot up. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Sterling. Box 402. It's quite a large one. Follow me." We descended into the basement, through a heavy circular door that looked like it belonged in a submarine. The air grew colder, smelling of ozone and old paper, when he pulled out the long metal drawer and left me alone in the private viewing room. I hesitated. My heart was thumping against my ribs. I felt like I was about to exhume a body. I lifted the lid. The first thing I saw wasn't money. It was passports. 3 of them. All featured Keith's face, but the names were different. Keith Sterling, Keith Vandross, Keith Beaumont. My breath hitched. He hadn't just been living a double life. He had been constructing an entire alternate identity. Beneath the passports lay a stack of ledger books, bound in weathered leather. I opened the top ledger. My eyes blurred as I tried to make sense of the columns. They weren't just bank balances. They were names of businesses, dates, and amounts. Huge amounts, labeled as consultation fees. But as I looked closer at the business names, I realized they were all shell companies. I recognized some of the names from the local news in Richmond. They were contractors who had won massive city bids for infrastructure projects. Keith hadn't been a simple consultant. He had been a bagman. He was the middleman for a massive kickback scheme involving city officials and construction firms. He was laundering money through these accounts, and the $200,000 I'd found in the envelope was just the tip of a very dirty iceberg. Then I found the photographs. They weren't of Yolanda or the child. They were of me. There were dozens of them. Me at the grocery store. Me at the garden club. Me sleeping in our bed. They were taken from a distance through windows from across the street. On the back of one photo, dated 6 months ago, was a scrawled note in a handwriting I didn't recognize. "She's getting too close to the North Side records. If she finds the ledger, the deal is off. Handle your wife, or we will." I dropped the photo as if it had turned into a spider. Keith hadn't just been cheating on me. He had been monitoring me. He had been protecting his criminal enterprise from his own wife. The love he showed me in those final months wasn't affection. It was surveillance. He was making sure I didn't stumble onto the truth that would send him to prison for the rest of his life. I realized then that Keith's heart attack might not have been an accident of nature. He was a liability to people far more dangerous than a disgruntled widow. I felt a sudden, sharp chill. If Keith was being watched, was I being watched right now? I looked up at the security camera in the corner of the small room. Was someone on the other side of that lens waiting to see if I'd found the ledger? I didn't panic. Panic is for the young. For a woman of 72 who has already lost everything, fear is just another tool. I reached into the box and grabbed the ledger, the passports, and the photos. I stuffed them into my oversized handbag. If these people thought they could intimidate me the way they intimidated Keith, they were sadly mistaken. He might have been a coward who hid behind silk linings and secret families, but I was a woman who had survived the Jim Crow era and 48 years of a lie. I wasn't going to run. I was going to use this evidence to burn every single person who had a hand in ruining my peace, starting with the people who threatened me. I walked out of that bank with my head held high, but as I reached my car, I noticed a dark SUV parked across the street. The windows were tinted, and the engine was idling. It didn't move. It just sat there, watching. I started my car and pulled out into traffic, my heart racing. The SUV immediately followed. I took a sharp turn, then another. It stayed right on my bumper. They weren't trying to hide anymore. They wanted me to know they were there. I reached into my bag and felt the weight of the ledger. I had the keys to their kingdom, and they were coming to take them back. The black SUV remained on my bumper like a persistent shadow, its tinted windows offering no glimpse of the threats inside. I wasn't scared. I was white-hot with fury. These people thought they could intimidate a 72-year-old widow who had just had her entire world incinerated. They thought I was fragile. They thought I was another Keith. They were about to learn that they had fundamentally miscalculated. I didn't lead them to a police station. Police could be bought, especially in a city steeped in the kind of high-level corruption Keith had been managing. No, I needed leverage, and I needed to draw the main player out. The text message from earlier was my only clue, a breadcrumb from someone who clearly knew Keith's secrets. I decided to trust the enemy of my enemy. I pulled into a crowded supermarket parking lot off Independence Boulevard, my hands steady on the wheel. This was a busy area, lots of cameras, lots of witnesses. I grabbed my phone and texted the unknown number. I have the ledger. Box 402 is empty. I'm being followed. Who are you and why should I trust you? I waited, my eyes darting between the rearview mirror, where the SUV sat idly at the edge of the lot, and my phone. A minute passed, then another. Finally, the response. The SUV works for Thomas Croft. City Council. If they get that ledger, you're dead. Go to the public library on trade. Main branch. History section. Come alone. Thomas Croft. The name hit me like a physical blow. Croft was the frontrunner for the upcoming mayoral race, a man who campaigned on family values and fiscal responsibility. He was the gold standard of Richmond's elite, and Keith had been his personal banker for bribes. I put the car in gear. The library was only 10 minutes away. I needed to see this ally. I walked into the massive glass-fronted library, the cool air momentarily calming my nerves. The SUV had parked across the street, watching. I headed straight for the history section on the third floor. It was deserted, filled only with the musty smell of old books and the quiet hum of the air conditioning. I scanned the aisles, the heavy ledger burning a hole in my oversized handbag. A figure stepped out from behind a shelf of Virginian history. It wasn't a man in a trench coat. It was a young black woman maybe 25, with tired eyes and a fierce, determined set to her jaw. "You're Mrs. Sterling," she said, her voice a quiet rasp. "And you are—" I demanded. "My name is Nia," she replied. She seemed to hesitate, glancing around before continuing. "I was Keith's secretary for 3 years. Before everything." "You knew?" I stated, the realization washing over me. "You knew about Yolanda. You knew about the kickbacks." Nia nodded, her gaze dropping. "I didn't have a choice. He was a powerful man. He said he'd erase my career and make sure my family lost their home if I spoke up. But I saw the ledger. I saw the names. Keith wasn't just Croft's bagman. He was the primary witness. When Croft found out the FBI was sniffing around, Keith became a liability." "You think they killed him?" I whispered, the thought finally coalescing. It wasn't just heartache that killed Keith. It was homicide. The night he had his heart attack, he had a private meeting with Croft. Nia explained, her voice trembling slightly. "He was scared. He told me he was going to expose everything to get an immunity deal. He was done being their puppet. He said he was doing it for his real family, meaning you. He was trying to fix it at the end." I stared at her, my mind reeling. Keith was trying to protect me by getting himself killed. The man who had spied on me was also, in his own twisted way, trying to save me. It was too much to process. "But I was still scared," Nia continued. "I knew where he kept his emergency backups. I'd been trying to get up the nerve to use them since the funeral, but when I saw Yolanda leaving the house with boxes, I knew the game had changed. I saw the envelope in the overcoat while I was cleaning his office. I didn't want Yolanda to find the ledger first." "You were the one cleaning?" I asked, my voice sharp. "I thought you were his secretary." "He had me do everything," Nia admitted, her face flushing. "Clean his office, manage his mistress's payments, run the bribe money. He thought he owned me, just like he thought he owned you." I felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness toward this girl. She was a victim, too. "I have the ledger," I said, patting my bag. "What's the plan, Nia?" Her eyes widened. "The plan? We take this to the FBI. We send Croft to prison." "No," I replied, a chilling clarity settling over me. "The FBI will take years. The courts can be manipulated. Thomas Croft is trying to become the most powerful man in Richmond. I don't just want him in prison. I want him decimated. I want him to watch everything he built crumble, just like my life did. I don't want justice, Nia. I want vengeance." Nia stared at me, her expression a mix of fear and awe. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make Thomas Croft an offer he can't refuse," I said, a smile that felt more like a baring of teeth touching my lips. "And you, Nia, are going to help me set the trap." We left the library separately. The SUV was still waiting. It started its engine the moment I opened my car door. They thought they were following the rabbit, but I was leading them straight to the wolf. I drove back toward Yolanda's house, but I stopped at a quiet park a few miles away. The SUV pulled in behind me. I didn't wait. I got out of the car and walked straight toward the driver's window. It rolled down, revealing a bulky man with a neck tattoo. He glared at me. "Give us the book, lady." "The book?" I said, leaning in. "You mean the ledger that details every bribe Thomas Croft has taken for the last 10 years? The one that names the shell companies and the Swiss accounts?" His expression shifted to surprise. "I'm not giving you the book," I continued. "I'm going to use it to bury your boss. But first, you're going to give him a message. Tell Thomas Croft that Mrs. Keith Sterling wants to talk. And tell him that if he wants the original copy of the ledger, he'll meet me at the old tobacco warehouse on Dock Street at midnight. Alone. If I see one of his thugs or one cop, I will email the entire contents to the Richmond Times-Dispatch. The old tobacco warehouse on Dock Street stood like a rotting carcass against the Richmond skyline. The air here was different, salty, damp, and thick with the ghosts of a city's industrial past. I arrived 20 minutes early. I wasn't alone. Nia was tucked away in the shadows of the mezzanine, her phone set to record everything, her finger hovering over a send button that would blast the Ledger's digital scans to every major news outlet in the state. I stood in the center of the vast, hollowed-out floor, illuminated by a single, flickering overhead light. I didn't feel 72. I felt ageless. I felt like the personification of every secret Keith had tried to bury. At exactly midnight, the heavy iron door groaned open. Thomas Croft stepped inside. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car, his silver hair perfectly coiffed for a campaign poster. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a savior. That was his greatest weapon. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "You've caused quite a stir today. I'm truly sorry for your loss." Keith was a complicated man, but he was a friend. A friend. I laughed, the sound echoing harshly off the corrugated metal walls. "You don't send friends to early graves, Thomas. And you certainly don't send thugs to follow their widows. Let's skip the campaign speech. You're here for the Ledger." I held up the leather-bound book. His eyes tracked it with the hunger of a starving man. "Keith was weak," Croft said, his tone shifting. The mask of the politician was slipping, revealing the predator underneath. He wanted to grow a conscience at the 11th hour. That's a dangerous hobby in our line of work. He was going to ruin a project that will bring thousands of jobs to this city. "You mean a project that will put millions into your offshore accounts?" I countered. "I've read the notes. Thomas, I know about the North Side development. I know Keith was moving the money through Yolanda's house." Croft took a step forward, his shadow stretching across the floor like a stain. "And what do you think you're going to do with that information, Hattie? You're a widow with a dead husband's dirty laundry. If you go to the authorities, you'll just be tarnishing his memory. You'll lose your house, your pension, everything. Keith's legacy will be that of a thief." "His legacy is already ash," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "I don't care about the house. I don't care about the money. I care about the fact that you thought you could use my life as a chess piece. Give me the book, and I'll make sure you're taken care of," Croft said, reaching out a hand. "I can make Yolanda disappear. I can make sure you live out your days in luxury. Don't be a fool. I've spent 48 years being a good wife and playing the fool, Thomas. That's over." I stepped back, clutching the Ledger to my chest. "I didn't bring you here to negotiate. I brought you here to show you what it looks like when you lose." "Lose?" Croft sneered. "I'm the next mayor of this city. You're a ghost. Check your phone, Thomas." He frowned, reaching into his pocket. As he looked at the screen, I saw the color drain from his face. Nia had just sent him a snippet of the video, the one she was recording right now. It showed him standing in this warehouse, admitting that Keith was weak for wanting to grow a conscience. "You're recording this?" he hissed, looking around frantically at the dark corners of the warehouse. "It's already being uploaded to a secure cloud," I said. "And the Ledger? It's not the only copy. My lawyer has the original. This one." I held the book over a small trash can I had filled with lighter fluid before he arrived. "This one is just for the drama." I struck a match. The flame danced for a second before I dropped it into the can. The Ledger caught instantly, the secrets of Thomas Croft curling into black smoke. "You crazy old woman." Croft lunged at me, his face contorted in a mask of rage. But I wasn't there. I stepped aside with a grace I hadn't felt in years. From the shadows, The flash of a dozen cameras erupted. It wasn't the police. It was the press. Nia hadn't just called the news. She had invited the most aggressive investigative reporters in the city to witness the private meeting between a grieving widow and the leading mayoral candidate. Croft froze, his hand still raised as if to strike me. The red and blue lights of police cruisers began to swirl against the warehouse windows. "You should have looked at the guest list, Thomas," I said, smoothing my skirt. "I told you I wanted a different story. And in this version, the villain doesn't get the girl, the money, or the city." As the police swarmed the building, Croft was led away in handcuffs, his career ending in a flurry of flashbulbs. But as I turned to find Nia, she was gone. In her place, on the mezzanine floor, sat a single white envelope. I opened it, and my heart stopped. It was a photo of Keith, taken years ago with a woman I didn't recognize, and she was holding a baby that looked exactly like me. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers danced against the rusted corrugated metal of the warehouse, but I was suddenly deaf to the sirens and blind to the chaos. Thomas Croft was being shoved into the back of a car, his political career ending in the cold snap of handcuffs, but I couldn't bring myself to care. My entire world had shrunk to the size of the glossy photograph in my hand. I climbed the metal stairs to the mezzanine where Nia had been stationed. She was gone, vanished into the shadows of the docks like a phantom. But the white envelope she left behind felt heavier than the ledger I had just burned. I looked at the photo again under the dim, yellow light of the warehouse rafters. It was Keith. He looked younger, maybe in his late 30s. He was standing in front of a small white-clapboard house. Not our house in Richmond, but somewhere rural, somewhere hidden. He was smiling with a genuine warmth I hadn't seen in decades. Beside him stood a woman with dark, piercing eyes and a regal tilt to her chin. She was holding a bundle in her arms, a baby girl. The woman didn't just look like me. She was me, or rather, she was the woman I saw when I looked at old Polaroids of my mother. My breath hitched, a jagged sound in the silent upper level of the warehouse. If that was my mother, and that was Keith, and that was a baby, my mind refused to do the math. It couldn't be. Keith and I had met in our 20s. We had grown up in different towns. My parents had died in a car accident when I was barely 21. Keith had been the one to pull me out of that grief. I turned the photo over. Scrawled in the same feminine, loathsome script I had seen in Yolanda's house were 5 words that shattered my soul. He didn't find you. He kept you. A wave of nausea rolled over me. I grabbed the railing to keep from collapsing. All these years, I thought I was the one who chose Keith. I thought we had built a life on mutual love and shared history. But if this photo was real, our history wasn't shared. It was manufactured. I stumbled down the stairs and walked past the reporters, ignoring their shouted questions about Croft and the bribery scandal. I got into my car and drove, my mind a whirlwind of static. I didn't go back to the house in Richmond. I couldn't stand the thought of those walls. Instead, I drove to the one place that held the records of my life before Keith, the old Methodist church in the outskirts of Petersburg where my parents were buried. The graveyard was silent, the headstones silvered by the moonlight. I found their plot, Isaiah and Martha Vandross. Vandross! The name hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Yolanda Vandross! I fell to my knees in the damp grass. My mother's maiden name had been Vandross. I had always told Keith that I had no living relatives on her side. He had comforted me, told me he would be my entire world. And he was. He was my husband, my best friend, my protector. But Yolanda wasn't just a mistress. If she was a Vandross and Keith was Keith Vandross in one of those passports, I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers and called the one person who might have the missing piece. I didn't call a lawyer. I called my older sister's daughter, Camille. We hadn't spoken in years because Keith had convinced me she was only after our money. Camille, I whispered when she picked up, her voice thick with sleep. I need you to tell me the truth. Why did my mother and father really die? And why did you stop coming to the house 30 years ago? There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end. Then, a sob. Auntie, we didn't stop coming because we wanted to. Keith sent us a restraining order. He told us you never wanted to see us again. He said you blamed us for the fire. The fire? I gasped. It was a car accident. Keith told me they died in a crash on the way to the coast. No, Camille cried. It was a house fire. Auntie. And the police report said it was arson. But the lead investigator was a man named Thomas Croft. He closed the case in 48 hours. I dropped the phone into the grass. The pieces didn't just fit. They locked into place with a terrifying, lethal click. Keith hadn't just stolen my retirement or cheated with a younger woman. He had stolen my entire identity. He had cleared the board of my family, used his connection with a corrupt politician to cover the tracks, and then stepped in to save the grieving heiress to a family estate I never even knew I had. I wasn't a widow seeking revenge for a secret daughter. I was a survivor of a lifelong kidnapping. My marriage wasn't a union, it was a prison sentence. And the woman in Charlotte, Yolanda, she wasn't just his mistress. She was the daughter of the man Keith used to be. I stood up, the grief replaced by a cold, predatory stillness. I looked at the headstones of my parents and made a vow. Keith was dead, but the world he built on their ashes was still standing. I reached into my pocket and found the key to the second safety deposit box Nia had mentioned in a text I'd ignored earlier. It wasn't in a bank. It was in a bus station locker in Durham. The drive to Durham was a blur of neon highway signs and the haunting realization that my reflection in the rearview mirror was a stranger's. For 72 years, I believed I was Hattie Sterling, the beloved wife of a pillar of the community. Now, I was a woman without a past, standing on the edge of a jagged truth. The Durham bus station was a relic of a different era, smelling of diesel fumes, stale coffee, and the weary desperation of people moving from one life to another. I clutched the small silver key in my pocket, my fingers tracing the jagged teeth of the metal. Locker 114. I found it in a dim corner near the restrooms. The lock groaned as I turned the key, a sound like a heavy door closing on my previous life. Inside sat a small, battered metal box, the kind used for fishing tackle. It wasn't heavy, but it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds as I pulled it out. I sat on a nearby plastic bench, oblivious to the drifters and travelers passing by. I pried the lid open. Inside was a stack of birth certificates. One was mine, but the name wasn't Hattie. It was Harriet Vandross. My parents hadn't been Isaiah and Martha Vandross. They had been my aunt and uncle. My real parents were the couple in the photo, Keith's older brother, Arthur, and the woman with the regal chin. There was a crumbling newspaper clipping from 48 years ago. Tragic fire claims prominent Vandross family. Infant daughter missing, presumed dead. The air in the station turned thin. Keith hadn't just married me. He had abducted me. He had killed his own brother and sister-in-law to inherit the Vandross estate, a fortune built on North Carolina tobacco and land. And then he had raised me under a false identity, eventually marrying me to ensure no one would ever question the transition of the family's wealth. I wasn't his wife. I was his victim, his ultimate long game. Beneath the papers was a small, velvet-lined box. I opened it to find a heavy gold signet ring with the Vandross family crest, an hourglass entwined with a serpent. Beside it was a microcassette tape labeled, "For Harriet, the truth he couldn't kill." I didn't have a tape player, but I didn't need one to understand the magnitude of the horror. Keith had kept me in a gilded cage for nearly 5 decades, gaslighting me into believing I was a lonely orphan he had rescued. Every "I love you" was a shackle. Every anniversary dinner was a celebration of his successful crime. And Yolanda? She wasn't just his mistress. She was his legal daughter from a brief marriage he had in his youth. Before he found me, he had been using the Vandross fortune, my fortune, to fund her lifestyle, while keeping me as his puppet wife to maintain the legal facade of the Sterling Vandross merger. "You've been busy, Harriet." I froze. That voice. It wasn't Keith. It was younger, sharper, and filled with a terrifying familiarity. I looked up. Standing by the locker was a man who looked like a younger version of the photos of my father. He was wearing a dark suit, his eyes cold and calculating. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "I'm your cousin, Bill," he said, stepping into the light. "The one Keith told you died, in the fire. But I didn't die. I've been waiting for Keith to kick the bucket, so I could finally claim what's mine. And you, dear Harriet, are the only thing standing in the way of the Vandross inheritance." He looked at the metal box in my lap. "I see you found the proof. It's a shame, really. You could have lived out your days in that big house in Richmond, blissfully ignorant, but you just had to dig. You knew." I asked, a new kind of fury rising in my chest. "You knew what he did to me, and you stayed silent for 40 years. Keith was a monster, but he was a generous one," Bill sneered. "He paid for my silence. But the payments stopped 12 days ago. Now, I think it's time for a new arrangement. Give me the box, and maybe I'll let you go back to your widow routine. Refuse. And well, fires have a way of running in the family." Bill took a step toward me, his hand reaching for the box. I looked around the station. It was nearly empty. No one was coming to save me. I realized then that I wasn't the auntie or the widow anymore. I was Harriet Vandross, and I had spent 50 years learning how to handle a monster from the best teacher alive. I reached into my bag, but I didn't pull out the box. I pulled out the heavy brass paperweight I'd taken from Keith's desk. Bill stepped into the fluorescent light of the Durham bus station, a jagged smirk playing on his lips. He thought he was looking at a terrified 72-year-old grandmother. He didn't realize he was looking at a woman who had just realized her entire life was a crime scene. The grief was gone, replaced by a cold, surgical precision. "Give me the box, Harriet," he hissed, his hand outstretched. "You've lived a long, comfortable life on stolen money. It's my turn to enjoy the Vandross legacy. Don't make this difficult. You're an old woman in a bus station. No one will care if you have a fall." "You're right, Bill," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I am an old woman. And do you know what old women have that young men like you lack? Patience. And a very long memory." As he lunged for the metal box, I didn't flinch. I swung my heavy handbag, weighted down by Keith's solid brass eagle paperweight, with every ounce of the fury I had suppressed for 48 years. It caught him square in the temple with a sickening thud. Bill buckled, his knees hitting the grime-covered floor. He groaned, clutching his head, blood beginning to trickle between his fingers. Before he could recover, I leaned in, my shadow towering over him. Keith was a monster, but he was a genius. I whispered, You're just a scavenger. You thought you could shake me down? I've been managed by the best in the business for 5 decades. You're an amateur." I didn't wait for him to stand. I grabbed the metal box and walked toward the exit, my heart racing, but my mind sharp. I knew exactly where I was going. I wasn't going to the police. Not yet. I was going back to Charlotte. I was going back to the house Keith bought for Yolanda. If the Vandross fortune was the prize, then Yolanda was the last piece of the puzzle. I reached my car and threw the box onto the passenger seat. As I sped back toward the North Carolina border, I realized that Bill wasn't the only one Keith had been paying off. The ledgers I'd burned in the warehouse were just the political bribes. The real blood money was in the Vandross estate records. I arrived at Yolanda's house just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. The front door was ajar. I walked inside, the brass paperweight still clutched in my hand. The house was silent, but the smell of expensive perfume and cigarettes hung in the air. I found Yolanda in the kitchen, sitting at the marble island, a bottle of bourbon open in front of her. She looked haggard, her eyes red-rimmed. "He's dead, Auntie," she said, her voice hollow. "The news. They're saying Thomas Croft was arrested. They're saying Keith was a criminal. My life is over. The bank called. They're seizing the accounts." "Your life was a lie, Yolanda," I said, standing in the doorway. "Just like mine. But there's one difference. You knew Keith wasn't just your benefactor. You knew who I really was." Yolanda looked up, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I knew you were the golden goose. Keith told me the truth when I turned 21. He said as long as you stayed, Hattie Sterling, we would never want for anything. He said you were too weak to handle the reality of what happened to your parents." Weak. I walked toward her, the paperweight thumping onto the marble counter. "I'm the one standing here. Keith is in a box. Croft is in a cell. And Bill is bleeding on a floor in Durham. Tell me, Yolanda, where is the rest of it? The Vandross land deeds. Keith didn't keep them in the bank. He kept them somewhere he could see them." Yolanda's eyes flickered toward the basement door. "He has a safe. Behind the wine rack. But you'll never get into it. Only Keith had the code." "Keith didn't have a code," I said, a chilling realization dawning on me. "He had a ritual." I remembered every night for 48 years. Before bed, Keith would recite a specific string of numbers under his breath while rubbing his wedding ring. I thought it was a prayer. It wasn't. It was his combination. Our anniversary. The date he found me. The date he murdered my family. I headed for the basement. I reached the wine rack and swung it open, revealing the heavy steel door of a wall safe. My fingers trembled as I entered the numbers. 0-6-1-2-7-8. The date of the fire. The safe clicked open with a heavy, metallic groan. Inside wasn't just money. It was a stack of life insurance policies. On me, Keith had been planning his final act. He wasn't just going to keep me. He was going to profit from my death. But there was something else, a small vial with a handwritten label that made my blood run cold. The air in the basement was cold, smelling of damp concrete and the metallic tang of the safe. I held the small glass vial up to the single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The liquid inside was clear, innocent-looking, but the label in Keith's precise, architect-like handwriting made my heart skip a beat. Digitalis, concentrated. My stomach lurched. Digitalis, a heart medication that in high doses causes a natural cardiac arrest. The exact thing the doctors said killed Keith. But he hadn't been taking it. I had. For 3 months, Keith had been bringing me my herbal tea every night, claiming it would help with my widow's anxiety even before he was gone. He wasn't just planning my death. He had been microdosing me for weeks. He didn't die of a heart attack. He died because he was careless with his own poison. Or perhaps he realized the FBI was closing in and tried to take his secrets and me to the grave. I tucked the vial into my pocket. My grief had long since evaporated, leaving behind a scorched earth, resolve. I climbed the stairs back to the kitchen, where Yolanda was still nursing her bourbon, her face a mask of pathetic ruin. "You knew about this, didn't you?" I asked, placing the vial on the marble island with a sharp clack. Yolanda's eyes widened, her hand trembling as she reached for her glass. I told him it was too much. I told him you were an old woman. You'd go soon enough on your own. But he was paranoid. He said if the Croft investigation went south, you'd be the first person the feds would squeeze. He couldn't risk you talking. He couldn't risk me finding out I owned everything he ever touched. I corrected her. I leaned over the counter, my face inches from hers. Here's what's going to happen, Yolanda. You have two choices. Choice one, I call the police right now. I hand them this vial, the records from the safe, and the testimony from Keith's secretary, Nia. You'll be charged as an accessory to attempted murder, embezzlement, and conspiracy. You'll spend the rest of your life in a state-issued jumpsuit. Yolanda choked on a sob, her expensive silk robe stained with spilled liquor. And choice two? Choice two? I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like dry leaves on a grave. You sign over every single asset Keith put in your name. The house, the cars, the offshore accounts he funneled from the Vandross estate. You take your daughter, you leave Charlotte, and you never, ever let me see your face again. You become a ghost, just like you tried to make me. I can't just leave with nothing, she shrieked. You're not leaving with nothing, I said, tapping the brass paperweight. You're leaving with your freedom. For now. But if I ever hear the name Vandross or Sterling from your lips, I will ensure the authorities find enough evidence in that basement to bury you 10 times over. I pulled a stack of legal documents I'd prepared with Nia's help from my bag. Sign. Now. With shaking hands, Yolanda scrawled her name across the lines. Every stroke of the pen was a piece of my stolen life coming back to me. When she was done, she looked at me with a mixture of hatred and terror. You're just like him, she spat. Cold. Calculating. You didn't just want the truth, you wanted the power. No, I replied, standing tall. I didn't want his power. I wanted my own back. Keith spent 48 years trying to erase Harriet Vandross. He failed. And now, I'm going to make sure the world knows exactly who he was. I watched from the driveway as Yolanda packed a single suitcase into her SUV and drove away, her daughter's confused face pressed against the rear window. I didn't feel pity. I felt a grim satisfaction. The house was mine. The fortune was mine. The truth was mine. But I wasn't finished. There was still the matter of the car accident that killed my parents. There was still the matter of Bill, who was likely waking up in a Durham hospital with a very long list of questions. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. This is Harriet Vandross, I told the operator. I have a story for your front page. It involves a dead hero, a corrupt politician, and a 50-year-old murder that's about to be solved. I hung up the phone and walked back into the house, heading for Keith's private study. I sat in his leather chair and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. There, tucked under a false bottom, was a small, leather-bound diary I hadn't seen before. I opened it to the last entry, dated the day before he died. The words stopped my breath. Harriet knows. I saw it in her eyes tonight. The tea isn't working fast enough. I have to finish this tomorrow, or Bill will talk. I sat in the silence of Keith's mahogany-paneled study, the leather-bound diary heavy in my lap. The man who had shared my coffee, my bed, and my secrets for nearly 50 years had documented his own failure to kill me. He wasn't just a thief. He was a predator who had run out of time. But as I read the final entry again, the name Bill stood out like a bloodstain on a white sheet. Keith hadn't died of a random heart attack. He had died because Bill, the scavenger cousin, had decided that waiting for an inheritance was taking too long. Bill hadn't just known about the digitalis. He had swapped the vials. Keith had been drinking his own poison, thinking he was serving it to me. I stood up, the brass paperweight now joined by a heavy manila folder of deeds and the digitalis vial. I didn't feel like a 72-year-old widow anymore. I felt like a force of nature. I drove back to Richmond one last time. I didn't go to our house. I went to the police headquarters. I walked past the desk sergeant, ignoring the authorized personnel only signs, and marched straight into the office of the lead investigator on the Thomas Croft case. "My name is Harriet Vandross," I said, dropping the diary, the vial, and the ledger onto his desk. "And I'm here to report a 50-year-old triple homicide, an ongoing embezzlement scheme, and the murder of Keith Sterling." The investigator, a man with graying temples and tired eyes, looked at the evidence. As he read the diary entries, his face shifted from skepticism to sheer horror. "Mrs. Sterling," he started. "Vandross," I corrected him. "My name is Harriet Vandross, and I want Bill Vandross arrested before he leaves that hospital in Durham. He killed Keith, and he helped cover up the murder of my parents 48 years ago." The wheels of justice, so often slow and rusted, began to turn with a violent speed. Within 2 hours, Bill was in custody. Within 4, the Richmond Times-Dispatch had released the headline that would shake Virginia to its core: "The Widow's Reckoning. Prominent socialite revealed A.S. stolen heiress in decades-long conspiracy." I spent the next 3 days in a hotel, watching the world I knew burn to the ground on the evening news. Thomas Croft resigned in disgrace before the FBI could even finish their first interview. Yolanda's hush money accounts were frozen, and she was detained for questioning regarding her knowledge of the attempted poisoning. I returned to the house on Monument Avenue one final time. It was a beautiful structure, but to me, it was a mausoleum. I walked through the rooms, looking at the furniture Keith had bought with my family's blood. I didn't want any of it. I called a demolition crew. "I want it leveled." I told the foreman, "Everything. Don't leave a single brick standing." "But, ma'am, this house is worth millions," he stammered. "This house is a lie," I replied, "and I'm done living in shadows." As the wrecking ball swung for the first time, I stood on the sidewalk, my back to the dust and debris. I had already signed the papers to donate the land to the city for a public park, the Vandross Memorial Park. It would be a place for families who actually loved each other, a place where no secrets were buried. I took the gold signet ring from the metal box and slipped it onto my finger. It was heavy, a reminder of a lineage that had almost been erased. I wasn't the grieving widow of a criminal. I was the architect of my own liberation. I looked at the camera of the news crews standing nearby, giving them the same cold, steady gaze I had given Keith every night. They thought I was a victim. I said, my voice clear and ringing across the pavement. They thought 72 years was too old to fight. But the truth is, I've only just begun to live. I walked away from the rubble of my past, stepping into the bright, uncompromising light of a future I finally owned. Keith was gone. The lies were dead. And Harriet Vandross was finally home. The house is gone. The criminals are behind bars, and the Vandross name is restored. But as I settled into my new apartment overlooking the James River, a courier arrived with a package. It was a letter from a law firm in Switzerland, dated 20 years ago, with a simple instruction. In the event of both Keith and Harriet's deaths, the keys to the vault in Zurich are to be handed to the person named in the sealed envelope. I opened the envelope, expecting to see Yolanda or Bill. Instead, it was a name I had never heard before, Nia Vandross. The story isn't over. It's just the beginning of a new mystery. Who is Nia Vandross? Is she the daughter I never knew I had, or something even more shocking? If you loved seeing justice served, you must subscribe right now and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who thinks grandmas are pushovers. Thank you for watching Vintage Vengeance, where the truth always bites back.